Welcome, my friend. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. This evening, we'll be wandering far back in time to the wind-swept highlands and mist-covered glens of medieval Scotland, a land of rugged beauty and harsh, unyielding life. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. If you feel like sharing, just leave a gentle note in the comments. Now, let your thoughts drift across ancient hills to stone-built villages where the air carries the scent of peat smoke and the sound of the wind seems older than memory. Tonight, we'll step quietly into a Scotland of long ago, where the winters were biting, the clans were restless, and survival was a daily, unending challenge. So, settle into the stillness as we open the door to the Scotland of the Middle Ages. Scotland, single quotes, as land has centuries been shaped by harsh weather, high mountains, boggy valleys, and relentless coastal winds. In the medieval period, roughly from the 11th to the 15th century, life here was a constant struggle. Wars with England, clan disputes, and the scarcity of fertile farmland made survival a daily challenge. There were no paved roads, no formal medical care, and no easy access to food. Life expectancy was far shorter than what we know today, and the greatest challenge of each year was surviving the coming winter. The weeks before winter, those early months of autumn, were the most crucial time of the year for medieval Scots. When the first dusting of snow appeared on the mountain peaks, one question echoed through every home: have we gathered enough to survive until spring? By August and September, farmers had their final chance to bring in the rewards of the growing season. Oats, the staple crop of the highlands, were cut, dried, and stored in sacks that were hung high from the rafters to keep them safe from rats. And damp, root vegetables like turnips and carrots were packed into pits or wrapped in leaves, hidden from frost so they could still be eaten in the deep winter months. Animals were a vital part of this preparation. Once the grass stopped growing, cattle and sheep had to rely entirely on hay cut during the summer. Families rationed the feed carefully. Too much too early meant empty stores before February. Too little meant the animals would weaken and die before the thaw. Keeping livestock alive was about more than just meat. They provided milk, wool, hides, and in some cases, the warmth of their bodies when housed close to humans. If meat was available at all, it had to be salted or smoked for preservation. Along the coasts, fish were dried and stored, sometimes traded inland in exchange for grain or wool. Every household kept strict count of its supplies, deciding exactly how much could be eaten each day to avoid running out before spring's first green shoots appeared. Winter preparation was not only about food. Doors and thatched roofs were repaired one last time, and moss or turf was packed into wall gaps to keep the wind from slicing through the house. Woolen clothing was patched or made thicker, and children were often made to sleep near the animals for extra warmth. Yet, despite all these preparations, the arrival of winter was always a gamble. An early snow could cut off travel, a storm could spoil stored food, and disease could sweep through the weakened population. The dark months ahead tested not only skill and discipline, but also endurance and sheer willpower. Still, beyond the cold and the hunger lay a deeper question: how long could an ordinary Scot truly hope to live in a land where every year was a battle against the elements? As autumn days in the Scottish Highlands drew shorter, the urgency to prepare for winter intensified. By late October, the once green glens were turning brown, and icy winds swept in from the north. The poor families of the Highlands knew that survival over the next few months depended entirely on the work they did now. Every able-bodied person, from children to the elderly, had a role to play. Food storage became the first priority. Potatoes, turnips, and oats were gathered and stored in small stone huts or underground pits lined with straw. These caches were crucial because deep snow could block travel to nearby villages for weeks. Dried fish, salted meat, and hard oatcakes were stacked high. These humble provisions might mean the difference between life and death by January. Firewood was the second lifeline. In a landscape where trees were scarce, gathering enough peat for fuel was essential. Peat was cut in the warmer months and left to dry, forming dense brown bricks that could burn slowly through the night. The smoky scent of peat was familiar in every Highland home, clinging to clothes, hair, and blankets. Without it, winter nights in the drafty stone cottages would be unbearable. Animals were brought closer to the home, often sharing space with the family in a byre connected to the main living quarters. This was not only to protect livestock from predators and snowstorms, but also because their body heat helped warm the room. Chickens might roost in the rafters, and a cow or two might be tethered near the hearth. By the end of November, the last market trips were made to exchange surplus goods for salt, cloth, or iron tools. Once the first heavy snow fell, movement became nearly impossible, and the Highlands would be cut off into scattered, isolated pockets until spring. In those final days before the true winter arrived, there was a quiet urgency, a recognition that once the frost took hold, there would be no second chance to prepare. By late January, the Scottish winter reached its peak. Short, dim days barely lifting the sun above the horizon, and nights that seemed endless. For the poor in the Highlands, this was the period when all the earlier preparations were tested. Food stores were rationed carefully. A family might share a pot of thin oat broth for days, each person taking small portions to make it last. The smoked meat hung in the rafters like a precious treasure, only brought down in tiny pieces for flavor rather than a full meal outside. The wind howled through the glens, carrying with it fine icy snow that stung the skin. Travel was rare, and visitors even rarer. Paths between homes were buried under drifts, and most people stayed indoors, unless necessity, such as tending to animals, forced them out. Cattle and sheep, if they survived the cold, were kept in small stone enclosures or under crude shelters, their breath steaming in the frigid air. The survival of the animals was just as important as the survival of the family, for they were a source of milk, wool, and in desperate times, meat. Inside the cottages, people huddled near the fire, its glow the only source of comfort in the long, dark hours. Stories, songs, and the simple act of talking helped pass the time. In these moments, winter became not only a test of endurance, but also a season of closeness. Families bound together by necessity, sharing warmth, both physical and emotional. Outside, the snow piled high, but inside, life carried on in quiet defiance of the bitter Highland winter. For medieval Scots living in the Highlands and Lowlands alike, the months of late summer and early autumn were the busiest and most critical of the year. After months of hard labor in the fields, it was finally time to bring in the harvest, and more importantly, to make sure it lasted through the long, unforgiving winter ahead. In a land where crop failure could mean starvation, the careful gathering, drying, and storing of food was not simply routine. It was a matter of survival. Oats were the backbone of the Scottish diet, far more common than wheat. They grew better in the damp, cool climate and on poorer soils where other grains struggled. Once cut, the sheaves of oats were tied and left to dry in small stooks, their golden heads bending in the breeze. The drying process was essential. Damp grain could quickly rot or sprout, rendering it useless. After drying, the oats were threshed to remove the grain from the husk, then stored in sacks of woven cloth or sometimes in barrels. These were kept off the ground, often hung from beams or placed on raised wooden platforms to keep them away from rodents. Barley, though less common, was valued for brewing ale, a drink far safer than untreated water. It too required careful drying and storage. Villagers sometimes used communal kilns for drying both oats and barley, ensuring that even in wet years, the harvest could be preserved. The warm scent of drying grain marked the transition from summer to autumn in many rural communities. Root crops, especially turnips, parsnips, and carrots, were the other vital part of the food supply. Unlike grains, they could be kept fresh for months if properly stored. After being pulled from the earth, they were brushed clean of excess soil and layered in straw inside underground pits or small stone cellars. These pits, dug below the frost line, acted like natural refrigerators, keeping the roots cool and moist without freezing. Families would open them only when necessary, taking just enough to last a few days before resealing the pit to keep out. The cold, every step of the process required skill and discipline. One careless mistake, storing damp grain, failing to protect food from pests, or taking too much too soon, could bring hunger weeks before spring. Entire households worked together. Children might carry small bundles of grain. Women prepared the storage spaces, and men managed the heavy work of cutting and transporting the harvest. Yet even with careful planning, the Scots knew that the winter months were unpredictable. A bad storm could damage stored food. A burst of damp weather could cause mold to spread, or an unexpected visit from neighboring kin in need could deplete supplies faster than expected. The harvest was more than just a measure of agricultural success. It was the foundation upon which the survival of the whole community rested. But, as the last sacks of grain were tied and the final root pits sealed, one question always remained. Would this year's careful work be enough to outlast the hunger months ahead? Once the harvest was gathered and stored, the work of preserving it continued throughout the early winter. Even properly dried grain needed regular checking to make sure it hadn't been invaded by pests or spoiled by damp. In many Highland homes, sacks of oats were stacked in the driest corner of the house, often near the hearth where the low, steady warmth from peat fires kept moisture at bay. The smell of smoke and toasted grain became part of the household atmosphere, a reminder of the precious stores upon which survival depended. Barley received similar care, though it was often kept aside for brewing or trading. Ale was not just a drink, but a necessity, safer than most water sources, and a valuable source of calories during the cold months. Villagers would sometimes pool their barley together for communal brewing, which required large amounts of grain. This meant that careful storage was essential, not just for individual families, but for the entire community's well-being. Root crops demanded their own kind of vigilance. Pits or cellars had to be sealed well enough to keep out frost, but still allow for a little air circulation, preventing rot. Every few weeks, the pits were opened and checked. Any root showing signs of decay had to be removed immediately before the rot could spread to the rest. This was cold, back-breaking work, often done in snow or sleet, but it was necessary to keep the food stores edible until spring planting. Mice and rats were a constant enemy. Grain attracted them in droves, and a single winter could see entire sacks ruined if a family wasn't careful. Cats were treasured not as pets, but as working animals, kept to patrol storage areas and hunt down intruders. In more remote highland settlements, simple wooden traps baited with scraps were set near storage pits to keep rodents away from the winter food supply. Beyond the practical work, there was also a quiet, almost ritual significance to tending the stored harvest. Families knew that each bag of oats, each layer of straw-covered roots, represented the fruits of their labor from months past. To waste any of it was not just foolish, but shameful. Older generations often reminded children that a careless hand in autumn makes a hungry mouth in spring, a lesson learned from centuries of living on the edge of scarcity. Still, the question of sufficiency lingered in the minds of many. The weather in Scotland could be relentless. One storm too many, one unexpected freeze, and the balance between plenty and hunger could tip without warning. The stores might look full now, but would they still be enough when the snows lay thick and the thaw was months away? By midwinter, the reality of the harvest's success or failure became clear. The early days of storage, filled with the comfort of full granaries and well-sealed root pits, gave way to a more cautious pace of consumption. Every portion had to be measured. Oatmeal was often thinned into watery brose to make it last longer, while barley might be stretched into soups with wild greens or dried peas. Root crops were boiled into stews, their sweetness a welcome change from the monotony of grain. The discipline of rationing was as much a cultural habit as it was a necessity. Families understood that overeating during the early winter could mean weeks of near starvation before spring. Many kept careful tally of remaining stores, adjusting daily portions as the season wore on. In particularly harsh years, this meant living on smaller meals for months at a time. Each bite measured against the fear of empty pits before the first shoots of spring. Occasionally, the stored harvest had to be supplemented. Men might go out, hunting for deer or trapping rabbits, while women gathered seaweed along the coasts or dug for edible roots in the frozen ground. These foods were rarely enough to replace the staple stores, but they could stretch the supply, giving the oats, barley, and turnips a few more weeks of life. Fishing communities had an advantage, as salted or dried fish could stand in for grain when supplies ran low. Though storms often kept boats ashore for long stretches, there were also years when the harvest simply failed, when damp weather ruined the grain before it could be stored, or blight spoiled the root crops. In those years, the community's survival often depended on sharing and trade. Neighbors might lend grain with the expectation of repayment after the next harvest, though this generosity could be strained if several poor years came in succession. The thin line between charity and desperation was one that every villager knew well. Despite the hardships, the harvest stores were a point of pride. To open a sack of oats in February and find it as dry and sweet-smelling as the day it was stored was a sign of skill and care. These small victories brought reassurance in a season otherwise defined by scarcity. By late March or April, the final reserves were often little more than scraps, a last pot of porridge, a few wrinkled roots. Yet, if these stores lasted until the first fresh greens appeared, the long winter was considered a success. For medieval Scots, the storage of oats, barley, and root crops was not just an agricultural task, it was the beating heart of survival. Every sack tied in autumn, every pit sealed against the frost, was a step toward seeing another spring. And yet, as the stores dwindled and the days slowly grew longer, there was always the same lingering thought. Next year's harvest was still months away, and the cycle of labor and hope would begin again. In medieval Scotland, keeping meat and fish edible through the long, cold months was a task shaped by necessity, skill, and the limits of available resources. Fresh meat could only be eaten shortly after slaughter, within days in winter, and only hours in warmer months, unless it was preserved. In an age before refrigeration, the two most reliable methods for storing protein were salting and smoking, both of which transformed perishable food into something that could last for months. The process began in late autumn, when livestock that could not be kept through the winter was slaughtered. Cattle, sheep, and pigs required precious feed, and only the strongest or most valuable animals were spared for breeding. The rest were butchered before the frost set in, their meat destined for preservation. This was a time of heavy work, as entire families and sometimes whole communities joined in to process the meat quickly before it spoiled. Salt was the most important ingredient in this process, but also one of the most expensive. In the highlands, it was often imported from coastal towns or even from abroad, traded for wool, hides, or grain. Once obtained, it was used with care, rubbed deeply into cuts of meat or packed in layers with joints and ribs, drawing out moisture and creating an environment where bacteria could not grow. Barrels or wooden boxes were ideal for holding salted meat, kept in cool, dry storage spaces until needed. Fish, especially herring and salmon, played a major role in the Scottish diet, particularly in coastal and river communities. Fresh catches were gutted and split before being laid in heavy salt. Some fish were packed in barrels for transport and trade, while others were prepared for smoking. Smoking huts, simple stone or timber structures, kept smoldering fires, burning for days or even weeks, allowing fish to dry slowly in the warm, aromatic air. The result was a dense, savory food that could last deep into the winter, ready to be boiled, stewed, or eaten cold with bread. The flavor of these preserved foods was intense, far saltier and smokier than most modern palates might tolerate, but for medieval Scots, they were both a necessity and a comfort. Salted beef might be boiled for hours to soften it, the cooking water often reused for soups. Smoked fish was rehydrated in broth or broken into pieces for hearty oat cakes. These methods meant that even when hunting and fresh fishing became impossible, in deep winter there was still protein to sustain families. However, the amount preserved in autumn had to last until the first fresh catches of spring. A few too many generous portions early in the winter could mean bare larders by February. And, just like with grain or root crops, there was always the lurking danger of spoilage. If salt was spread unevenly or a smoking fire burned too hot or too cool, mold or rot could set in, wasting weeks of labor. The question for every household was not whether they could preserve meat and fish, but whether they could preserve enough and preserve it well enough to bridge the long, hungry gap between harvest and the next season of abundance. Once the salted meat and smoked fish were safely stored away, the real challenge began, managing their use across the many long months of winter. Preservation might make food last, but it didn't create abundance. Every salted joint or smoked side of fish was counted and recorded in the minds of those responsible for feeding the household. The largest households belonging to minor lairds or prosperous farmers could afford to set aside larger stocks. But for most crofters and fishermen, the preserved protein was modest at best. Salted meat, while dependable, was far from delicate in taste. After weeks in the brine or months packed in salt, the meat became tough and intensely salty. To make it edible, it was often soaked in fresh water, sometimes for an entire day, with the water changed several times to draw out the salt only. Then could it be boiled, usually with oats, kale, or root vegetables, to create a thick, filling broth. These cooking methods weren't just about flavor. They were about stretching every scrap of meat into as many meals as possible. Smoked fish required less preparation, but was equally precious. Depending on the smoking process, fish might last several months without spoiling. Cold smoking, which kept the fires smoldering at a low temperature for days or weeks, produced a drier, firmer product that could be stored longer. Hot smoking cooked the fish as it smoked, resulting in a more tender product, but one that had to be eaten sooner. Skilled smokers balanced these methods depending on how quickly the fish was needed and the availability of space in the smoking huts. Preservation was also shaped by the climate. In colder years, meat and fish lasted longer, while milder winters could encourage early spoilage. Rodents, insects, and dampness posed constant threats. In coastal areas, salty air and strong winds helped keep food dry, but inland, the damp highland climate meant that storage spaces had to be carefully monitored. A small leak in a thatched roof or a poorly sealed barrel could ruin a precious store overnight. Religious practices also played a role in rationing. The Catholic Church prescribed numerous fasting days when meat could not be eaten, encouraging the use of fish instead. This meant that smoked or salted fish often ran out faster than meat, especially in devout households. On the other hand, these rules could help stretch the supply of meat for longer periods. For many families, preserved protein was treated as a supplement rather than the center of the winter diet. The bulk of calories still came from oats, barley, and root crops, with salted meat or smoked fish added to give meals flavor and variety. By carefully combining the preserved foods with available grains and vegetables, even a small stockpile could carry a household through to the lean days of late winter. Yet, as the calendar turned toward February and March, the reserves grew dangerously low. Every barrel that was opened and every smoked fish taken from its hook was a reminder that the long wait for fresh meat and fish was not yet over. How did these households adapt when the last stores were finally gone, but the frost still held the land? By late winter, the carefully stored barrels of salted meat and the racks of smoked fish were often reduced to a fraction of their original number. What remained might be the tougher cuts of beef or mutton, heavily salted and less pleasant to eat, or fish that had dried to the point of hardness. These were not delicacies by any measure. They were survival food, kept for precisely this point in the year when the fields were still barren, rivers frozen or swollen with snowmelt, and hunting scarce. Households learned to make the most of what little remained. The hardest pieces of meat were chopped small and boiled for hours, with the cooking water becoming the base for soups and porridges. Bones were prized for their ability to flavor large pots of broth, and even the salty cooking water from earlier meals might be reused to preserve every bit of taste and nutrition. Nothing was wasted. Even fish skins, tough and leathery after smoking, could be boiled until softened and added to stews. Some years, the supply simply did not last. In such cases, people turned to alternative sources, trapping rabbits, fishing through ice, or gathering shellfish along the coast. These were risky ventures in winter, requiring time, energy, and exposure to the cold. But they could mean the difference between enduring hunger and falling into true famine. Communities often came together in this period, sharing what little they had. Neighbors might trade a smoked salmon for a small sack of oats, or a salted haunch of mutton for a supply of root vegetables still kept in an earthen store. This final stretch before spring was known for its weariness, not just of body, but of palate. Months of eating the same salty and smoky flavors could dull the appetite, and the first fresh foods of the year, often wild greens or early fish runs, were celebrated with genuine joy. By April or May, when livestock could once again graze and fishing boats returned to the water, the long period of reliance on preserved food was over. The barrels were cleaned, the smoking huts readied for the next season, and the cycle began. Again, the art of salting and smoking was more than just a culinary skill. It was an essential survival strategy, passed from one generation to the next. Mistakes were costly, and those who mastered the process held knowledge that could sustain entire families. Yet even the most skilled preservers could not control the length or severity of winter. Every year carried the question, had enough been stored, and would it last? The preserved meat and fish that survived until spring were not simply food. They were proof of careful planning, hard work, and resilience in the face of scarcity. But they were also a reminder of how fragile life was in medieval Scotland, when the turn of the seasons dictated whether one lived in comfort or on the edge of hunger. And in a world where survival depended on the stores laid down in autumn, one could not help but wonder how many winters ended with empty barrels before the first fresh catch arrived. In medieval Scotland, survival through winter was not just about feeding people, it was also about keeping the animals alive. Livestock were more than a source of food. They were a family's wealth, their labor force, and their insurance for the future. Cows provided milk, sheep gave wool, and oxen pulled the plows that would prepare the next season's fields. Without them, there could be no sustained farming, no steady milk supply, and no means of cultivating the land. Protecting these animals during the long, barren months was as vital as storing grain for human consumption. The Scottish climate, especially in the Highlands, made this task especially difficult. Snow could linger on the hills for months, and frost could harden the ground until it was impossible for livestock to graze. Even in milder lowland regions, the pasture was often too wet or too depleted to sustain animals through winter. This meant that by autumn, every household with animals needed to have gathered enough hay and fodder to last until the first spring grass appeared. Haymaking was a laborious summer task that began long before the harvest of oats and barley. Fields of grass were cut by hand, using scythes or sickles, and left to dry in the open air. This drying process, known as curing, was critical. If the hay was stored damp, it could rot or develop mold, making it inedible or even deadly for livestock. In years with constant rain, drying hay could take far longer, forcing farmers to spread it thin and turn it frequently in the hope of catching a stretch of sunny weather. Once dry, hay was stored in stacks or small barns. These stacks were often built in open spaces, raised slightly from the ground to protect against dampness, and carefully shaped to shed rain. The most successful farmers could produce enough hay to last the winter and still keep some in reserve for emergencies. Poorer crofters might have smaller stores, relying on supplementing the animal's diet with straw, rushes, or whatever scrub vegetation could be gathered from the hillsides. Feeding patterns were strict in winter. Hay was rationed just as food for humans was, with animals given only enough to keep them alive and in working condition. Milk yields often dropped sharply, and weaker animals might be culled early to reduce the feeding burden. Meat from these early slaughters was preserved for human use, but the loss of a milking cow or a strong ox could be a severe blow for the following year's work in the harshest winters. Hay might run out weeks before the grass returned. Farmers would then cut branches of trees such as birch or willow, stripping the bark and small twigs for the animals to eat. These emergency measures were never ideal, but they kept the herd alive until the first signs of green returned to the fields. The stakes were high. A man could recover from a poor winter by planting more crops the next year. But without livestock, his household would struggle for years to rebuild its strength. And so, as autumn faded into frost, one pressing question lingered in the minds of every farmer: had they gathered enough hay to see their animals and their future through to spring? As winter deepened, the management of hay stores became a daily calculation. Each morning, the farmer would measure out the feed, careful not to give too much at once. A cold snap might tempt him to be generous, but experience taught restraint. The season could still hold many more weeks of snow, and the hay had to last. Every mouthful given to the animals was weighed in the mind against the days still left before spring growth began. The barns or haystacks themselves required constant attention. A poorly secured haystack could collapse under the weight of snow, and moisture could seep in if the protective thatch or covering tore away in the wind. In wetter regions, stored hay was particularly vulnerable to rot. A few spoiled bundles might not seem like much in autumn, but by February, those lost armfuls could mean the difference between survival and starvation for an animal. Farmers often relied on the cooperation of neighbors in times of shortage. If one family's hay was running low, another might agree to trade a small quantity in exchange for milk later in the year or a share of the lambs in spring. This was not generosity alone, it was a recognition that in small rural communities, mutual survival was the best long-term strategy. But there were also years when no one had enough to spare, and even such arrangements could not be made. Alongside hay, some households prepared winter fodder from other sources. Straw from the autumn grain harvest could be mixed with hay to stretch supplies. In coastal areas, seaweed was sometimes gathered, washed to remove excess salt, and fed to animals when other forage was scarce. This practice was more common in the Western Isles and coastal highlands, where storms often threw up fresh tangles of kelp and bladderwrack. Such food might not fatten livestock, but it kept them alive until real pasture returned. The animals themselves showed the strain of the season. Their coats thickened and their movements slowed, conserving energy. Many were kept indoors or in small sheltered enclosures to protect them from wind and driving snow. But this created other challenges. Waste had to be cleared, air needed to circulate to prevent illness, and the cramped conditions sometimes led to disease spreading more quickly. A sick cow in winter was a serious problem. Treatment options were limited, and losing an animal meant losing months, if not years, of security. By late winter, the hay supply was often at its lowest. A farmer might stand in the barn, eyeing the remaining stack and calculating how many more days it could sustain his herd. Each feeding became a careful negotiation between need and preservation. The sound of animals tearing into their hay with eager hunger could be both reassuring and worrying proof that they still lived, but also a reminder of how quickly the precious store disappeared. And as the frost still clung to the earth and the winds carried no scent of green, one question returned to the forefront. What if spring grass came too late this year? The last weeks before spring were the most testing of all. By March, the stores of hay were often reduced to the thinnest layers. Farmers who had planned well might still have enough to keep their animals fed until the first shoots of grass appeared, but many others were forced into desperate measures. This was the period known quietly, without ceremony, as the Long Wait, a time when both humans and animals lived from day to day, watching the land for any sign of renewal. In some years, the thaw came early, and the burden eased, but more often, Scotland's late frosts and unpredictable weather delayed the return of green pasture. Farmers would lead their animals to the fields, hoping to find even a patch of young grass to nibble, only to see the herd wander restlessly, searching and finding little. It was in such moments that the value of every last bundle of hay became painfully clear. Sometimes the herd could not be fully sustained. The weakest animals were the first to suffer, losing weight rapidly and becoming too frail to recover. For smallholders, this was a tragedy with long-reaching consequences. A dead cow meant less milk for the household, less manure for the fields, and fewer calves in the coming years. Every loss reduced not just the farmer's livelihood, but the community's shared resilience. Survival strategies varied across the country. In the islands and coastal regions, seaweed remained a fallback until the grass grew strong again. Inland, farmers might cut rushes or bracken, dry them, and mix them with what little hay remained. Some even stripped bark from certain trees, providing fibrous, if unappetizing, nourishment. These practices were rarely recorded in official histories, yet they formed a quiet, essential part of rural life. When spring finally broke through, the ice melting from the streams, the earth softening underfoot, it was not a moment of instant relief. The grass needed time to grow before it could sustain grazing animals. Farmers would still ration hay for several weeks after the first signs of warmth, carefully balancing early grazing with the need to allow the pasture to recover. It was only when the fields had turned properly green and the animals began to regain weight that the true relief of survival set in. Looking back, these winter months revealed a truth about medieval Scottish life that the grand histories rarely mention. Survival was not just a matter of courage or endurance, but of planning, foresight, and a deep understanding of the land. A good hay harvest in summer could mean life in winter. A poor one could doom a family and its herd alike. It was a lesson learned each year, reinforced by the silent bond between farmer and field, between animal and human, and yet one could not help but wonder, in years when the hay ran out before the grass returned, how many lives, both human and animal, slipped quietly from the record, their stories lost in the long snows of Scotland's forgotten winters. The story drifts for a moment, and we find ourselves somewhere else, carried gently by the hush of night. Perhaps you are listening from a small lantern-lit room in Japan, where the paper walls hold in the soft glow, and the wind outside moves like a quiet sigh. Or maybe you are curled beneath a heavy quilt in the rolling countryside of the UK, where rain taps lightly at the window and the fire's last embers are fading to a slow, red glow. And somewhere, perhaps, in a stone-walled bedroom in France, the shutters are half closed against the moonlight, and the scent of night-blooming flowers lingers in the still air. Wherever you are, thank you for sharing this quiet journey with me. If you wish, you can let me know down in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. And now, we return to our story, the winter trade in Scotland, and the way it shaped the rhythm of life in the coldest months. In medieval Scotland, coins were not the main currency for most rural folk. Outside of the larger burghs and market towns, daily exchanges often relied on barter, the direct trade of goods and services. For the majority of small farmers, herders, and craftsmen, This was not a romantic notion of old-world simplicity. It was a matter of necessity. Money was scarce, and in the isolated glens and highland villages, it was often useless compared to the tangible value of food, tools, or materials. Trading year revolved around key moments. After harvest, surplus grain could be exchanged for livestock feed, salt, or cloth. In coastal communities, fishers might swap barrels of salted herring for wool or oats. In turn, inland farmers traded their oats for sea salt or smoked fish, to help see them through the winter months. Every exchange was shaped by what was available locally, and what could be spared without risking one's own survival. Bartering often took place at seasonal markets, known as fairs, which might draw people from miles around. These gatherings were as much social occasions as they were commercial, offering the chance to hear news, arrange marriages, or settle disputes. But for many, the central concern was securing goods that could not be produced at home: an iron plowshare from a blacksmith, leather from a tanner, or a bag of seed grain to replenish the fields. A skilled bargainer could stretch a small surplus into several useful acquisitions. In the smaller, day-to-day exchanges within a village, trust was the invisible currency. A neighbor might lend a tool on the understanding it would be returned promptly, or offer food with the expectation of repayment in the form of labor at harvest time. Reputation mattered greatly. A person known to be dishonest or slow in repaying favors would quickly find themselves excluded from the network of mutual aid that kept small communities afloat. Barter was also seasonal in nature. In summer, when the land was productive, exchanges tended to be generous. But in the lean winter months, the value of preserved goods, especially food, increased sharply. A basket of dried peas in February could be worth far more than the same amount in September. Some took advantage of this scarcity, holding back goods to trade at a higher value later. Others saw it as too risky, fearing that a sudden famine or theft could rob them of their stockpile before it could be exchanged. Travel for trade could be difficult, especially in the highlands, where the terrain was rugged and the weather often unforgiving. Drovers, those who herded cattle over long distances to markets, became a key link between scattered settlements. In many cases, they acted not just as transporters, but as intermediaries, carrying news and arranging trades between communities too far apart to meet directly. Yet, even with these networks, there was always uncertainty. What if the person you hoped to trade with had nothing to spare that year? What if winter storms delayed the drovers or closed the passes entirely? In such cases, families fell back on their own dwindling supplies, hoping that spring would come before hunger forced harsher choices. And in those long, cold months, one thought persisted: was there someone, somewhere, holding exactly the thing you needed, and would you be able to reach them before it was too late? As winter deepened in medieval Scotland, the rhythms of trade slowed but did not stop. In fact, some of the most crucial exchanges happened during these months, precisely because shortages became acute. If autumn fairs were times of abundance and variety, midwinter trades were often sharp, targeted transactions, with a clear understanding of what was scarce and what could be spared. Certain goods became especially valuable in the coldest weeks. Salt, for example, was indispensable for preserving meat and fish, and in the depths of winter, a small bag of it could be exchanged for far more than its autumn worth. Dried beans, peas, and barley were also in high demand, since they could be stored without spoiling. Even fuel bundles of peat, stacks of firewood, or dried heather was traded, sometimes for food, sometimes for tools. The movement of goods in winter often relied on small, trusted networks. Drovers and traveling peddlers were less common in the worst weather, so local exchanges carried more weight. A crofter might trade a goat's hide to the village shoemaker in exchange for repairs on winter boots, or swap a little of the last oat flour for a bundle of candles made from tallow. The barter was rarely perfect in value. Instead, people negotiated based on need, circumstance, and personal relationships. Occasionally, larger deals were struck to secure survival. A family with a surplus of dried fish might arrange a trade with a lowland farmer for a small sack of wheat flour. Such exchanges could span days of travel and might be made on the promise that repayment would come in spring. Once livestock birthed their young or new crops could be harvested. This type of debt barter was common and depended heavily on trust, and sometimes on written agreements in more literate communities. Winter trading also exposed the subtle hierarchy of rural life. Wealthier farmers, with larger stores and more animals, could afford to hold back goods and trade them later at more favorable terms. Poorer families, lacking reserves, often had to barter early in the season, when their goods were worth less, or risk having nothing to exchange at all. This imbalance shaped the quiet power dynamics of villages, sometimes fostering resentment, but just as often reinforcing the role of influential families as community anchors. In some areas, barter went beyond the purely practical, handmade items, such as carved wooden spoons or embroidered cloth, were traded not only for their usefulness, but also for the small comfort they brought in the darkness of winter. In an age when luxuries were rare, these exchanges carried emotional weight, strengthening bonds between households. But there was always risk in trading during scarcity. A journey to a neighboring settlement for barter could be hampered by snowstorms, swollen rivers, or ice-covered passes. Worse still, there was no guarantee the hope for goods would be available when you arrived. Failed trades meant returning home with lighter packs and heavier worries. In this way, bartering in the heart of winter became as much about maintaining social connections as it was about acquiring goods. Every successful trade was a reminder of the invisible web linking scattered households, a web that could stretch across valleys and over mountains, but could also fray under the pressure of hunger and cold. By late winter in medieval Scotland, bartering took on a different tone. What had begun in autumn as the cheerful swapping of surpluses became the redistribution of necessities. By January and February, when food stores were lowest and the next harvest was months away, trading turned sharper, edged with quiet desperation. Goods in circulation were fewer and more precious. The best oats and barley were gone. What remained were smaller, cracked grains, fit only for porridge. Meat was rare and less salted or smoked months earlier, and even preserved fish could be nearly exhausted. Those with such goods could ask almost anything in return: tools, clothing, or promises of future labor. In the Highlands, trust trade was common. A crofter might give a neighbor dried peas now in exchange for help plowing fields in spring, or a lamb from the first births. These agreements were rarely written down, but reputations depended on keeping them. A single breach could follow someone for years, closing doors to future exchanges. Scarcity bred ingenuity. Deer antlers, shed naturally in winter, could be shaped into tools or ornaments and traded for food. Strips of hide, unfit for clothing, might be swapped for fuel. Even small items, a spindle, a fishing hook, could carry surprising weight. In a midwinter deal, larger settlements acted as trade hubs. Villagers from outlying hamlets braved snow and wind to find what they lacked. These gatherings were quieter than autumn fairs. Fewer stalls, more hushed negotiations. Goods were exchanged, but so was information. News of weather, livestock losses, or illness in nearby glens. Such knowledge could influence trade as much as the goods themselves. Winter trade also revealed divisions. Some wealthy families held back goods to sell later at higher value, sometimes to ensure their own security, sometimes to gain advantage. For poorer households, survival might mean parting with heirlooms or tools vital for spring work, sacrificing the future for the present. Yet cooperation endured, especially in close-knit villages. Families might quietly give grain or meat to struggling neighbors, disguising it as an uneven trade to preserve dignity. These gestures, though unspoken, were remembered for years, strengthening bonds that could prove as valuable as the goods themselves. By spring, the urgency of bartering faded, replaced by the work of planting and the hope of new growth. But winters, trades left a mark. Promises had to be honored, debts repaid, and trust restored where it had frayed. In a land where survival was always uncertain, the trade of winter was more than an exchange of goods. It was a measure of a community's resilience, and as each year turned, the question remained: when the next winter came, would the bargains struck still hold their worth? In medieval Scotland, the approach of winter was not just marked by shorter days and colder winds, but by a shift in the way people thought about food. After the harvest had been gathered and the last animals slaughtered for winter meat, households entered a period of careful calculation. Every sack of oats, every salted fish, every bundle of dried herbs was counted, weighed, and stored away. The dark months ahead were long, and without a strict rationing plan. Survival was uncertain. Families typically began this process in late October or early November, just as the first frosts hardened the ground in small crofts and highland cottages. The head of the household would spread the season's stores out for inspection. Grain was measured into portions, often using wooden scoops passed down through generations. Root vegetables were sorted by size, with the best kept for later months, when the body needed more sustenance. Even the peat and firewood supply was considered part of the winter ration. Without heat, food alone could not keep a family alive. The challenge was to balance the need for nourishment with the need to make supplies last until spring. A family might decide that porridge would be eaten twice a day instead of 3 times, or that meat would only be served on Sundays and special days like Christmas. These rules were rarely broken. Every extra ladle of stew in December might mean one less in February, and February was the month everyone feared. Rationing also extended to the animals that survived the winter: milk cows, sheep, and sometimes chickens. Their feed had to be measured as carefully as the family's food. If the hay ran out before the first fresh grass of spring, livestock would starve, and with them the hope of milk, wool, and meat for the coming year. Keeping track of the stores was a weekly ritual. A careful eye watched for signs of spoilage: damp oats, rotting roots, or mold on dried meat. If something began to go bad, it was eaten immediately to avoid loss. But such unplanned meals often disrupted the rationing schedule, forcing further adjustments and tighter control over the remaining food in some cases. Communities agreed on shared rationing practices. Neighbors would check on each other, making sure no family was falling behind in their planning. It was not just kindness in small villages. One family's hunger could become everyone's problem. A starving household might be forced to ask for charity or, in desperate cases, take what they needed without asking. Careful rationing prevented such tensions from escalating. The process was not without its quiet stresses. Children were often too young to understand why food was limited when storerooms looked full. Parents found themselves inventing explanations, turning scarcity into routine so that the children would not feel the bite of hunger too keenly. Still, even the most careful planner could not control the weather. A long winter or an early frost the following year could make all the rationing in the world insufficient. The people of medieval Scotland knew this well, and as they finished their tallies and locked away their stores for another week, the question always remained: had they counted enough, and would it last? By the heart of winter, rationing was no longer an abstract plan. It was a daily habit, woven into the rhythm of life. Each morning, the day's portions were brought out from the storage chests, sacks, and barrels. A scoop of oats for porridge, a handful of dried peas for the soup, perhaps a small piece of salted meat if it was a special day. Nothing more, nothing less. The household knew that every extra mouthful now was a mouthful stolen from the future. It was in January and February that the rationing became most severe. The early weeks of winter could feel deceptively comfortable, with full granaries and stocked pantries giving a false sense of security. But as the days dragged on and the candle burned earlier each evening, the visible reduction in supplies reminded everyone that the worst was still ahead. These were the days when the temptation to break rationing rules was at its strongest, and when discipline mattered most. Some households had a designated person to oversee the distribution of food, often the mother or grandmother, whose role was as much about enforcing fairness as about preserving supplies. She would ensure that portions were even, that no one took more than their share, and that children's pleading eyes did not sway the rules. In this way, rationing became both a practical necessity and a form of social control within the home. For those with animals, the balance was even more delicate. Livestock feed was measured with the same precision as human meals. If hay was running low, farmers sometimes cut branches from trees so that sheep or goats could eat the leaves and bark. In harsher years, straw from thatched roofs might even be pulled down and fed to animals, sacrificing shelter for the sake of survival. These choices were never made lightly. Every resource was interconnected, and taking from one need could create another dot. To stretch the stores, people turned to methods of making less food feel like more. Thin soups, often made with nothing but hot water, herbs, and a small quantity of grain or dried vegetables, filled stomachs without using much from the pantry. Porridge was bulked out with chopped turnips or parsnips. Bread was sometimes made with a mix of barley flour and ground up dried peas or beans, producing a dense loaf that was filling, if not particularly pleasant. Despite the careful planning, some families inevitably reached a point where rations had to be cut further. Meals shrank from 3 to 2 a day, and portions became smaller still. At this stage, survival relied as much on endurance as on planning. People would distract themselves with work, small crafts, or storytelling by the hearth to keep their minds from dwelling on hunger. Yet no matter how bleak it seemed, there was always the hope that the weather might turn early, that the frost might retreat sooner than expected. But the people of medieval Scotland knew that hope alone was not a strategy. The stores, once measured and counted, had to be made to last. And as the dark months pressed on, the question grew heavier. Just how thin could the rations become before the body and spirit gave way? By late winter, the act of measuring the stores had become almost ritualistic. Every few days, someone would open the grain bins or lift the lids from the salted meat barrels to check what remained. The sound of grain sliding in the bin, the faint smell of dried roots, the briny air rising from the meat, all were reminders of how little separated survival from scarcity. These inspections were not just about knowing how much food was left. They were about making decisions, sometimes difficult ones, that could affect the household's fate. It was during these final weeks before spring that the calculations became more precise. If there were, for example, 2 stone of oats left, the head of the household would work out exactly how many days it could last, adjusting daily portions down to the smallest scoop necessary to stretch supplies. A little extra on one day meant an even tighter cut the next. The balance was as much mental as mathematical optimism had to be tempered with cold arithmetic. For many, this was also the time when the most unpleasant substitutions became necessary. If the stores of barley and oats were almost gone, bread might be made with ground acorns or dried nettle leaves. These were bitter and hard to digest, but they filled the belly. Meat rations, once a small comfort, might disappear entirely in the final month. Root vegetables, wrinkled, sprouting, and soft, were eaten without complaint. Nothing was wasted. Even the water used to boil vegetables was drunk as soup. Some families prepared for this stage by keeping a hidden reserve, a small secret store set aside for emergencies. This reserve was not touched unless there was no other option, and even then it was opened reluctantly. Such hidden supplies were a sign of prudence, but also of deep mistrust in the uncertainty of the seasons. The psychological strain of this period was as real as the physical hardship. Knowing exactly how little was left, day after day, could weigh heavily on the mind. Stories of past winters, when supplies ran out too soon, were quietly told as warnings. Evenings by the fire became quieter. The energy for long conversations faded along with the energy in the body. Yet, despite the weariness, there was a stubborn determination to endure, to hold out just a little longer. Then came the first true sign of change. A patch of green on the hillside, the song of a bird, not heard since autumn, the drip of melting snow from the eaves, but it was a cautious hope. Farmers knew that a single warm day did not mean winter was over, and grazing too early could ruin the new growth. So the stores were measured once more, the rations maintained for a few more weeks, until the land was ready to give again. And in that moment, when the first animals were let out to pasture and the people could taste fresh milk or eat greens from the earth, the months of discipline were vindicated. Yet the question lingered for the next year: would the stores last again, or would fortune turn the other way? In medieval Scotland, foraging was not simply a pleasant pastime of gathering wild foods in the countryside. It was an essential survival skill, especially in the depths of winter. Long after the harvest was over and the last market day had passed, the land still offered its quiet resources to those who knew where to look. The practice of foraging during the coldest months was a blend of inherited knowledge, sharp observation, and patient labor. By November, most berries and soft fruits were gone, but certain hardy plants and stores from earlier months could still be found. Hazel trees, common across the lowlands and parts of the highlands, provided nuts that, if gathered in autumn and kept dry, could last through the dark months. These nuts were rich in fat and energy, a welcome addition to a diet that was otherwise heavy with grains and roots. Families often stored them in sacks hung from rafters, safe from damp and rodents. Roots were perhaps the most dependable wild foods in winter. Burdock, wild parsnip, and pignut could be dug from the frozen ground with enough persistence. The work was slow, and the earth was often stiff with frost. But these roots provided carbohydrates when other fresh foods were scarce. Some families boiled them into soups. Others roasted them in the hearth ashes for a softer, sweeter taste. Knowledge of where these plants grew was carefully passed down, often kept as closely guarded as a family secret. Certain berries also clung to the land well into the cold months. Rose hips, the bright red fruit of the wild rose, could survive frost and provided a rare burst of color in the bare winter landscape. These were valued not just for their tart flavor, but for their medicinal qualities, as they were one of the few sources of vitamin C available during the season. Elderberries, if dried before the frost, could be stored and used in warming drinks or simple preserves. Foraging in winter was not without risk. Travel through snow and ice could be treacherous, and the effort of searching for food burned precious calories. In the highlands, where settlements were scattered, the nearest patch of hazel trees or known root beds might be miles away. Those who ventured out needed a strong sense of the land and its hidden offerings, as well as the endurance to bring their findings home. Even in these harsh months, foraging had a social dimension. Neighbors might trade what they had found, hazelnuts for dried berries, or roots for a handful of grain. This sharing strengthened community bonds, but it was also practical. Not every family knew every good spot, and cooperation increased the chances of survival yet. Despite all this knowledge and skill, foraging in winter could never fully replace the need for stored supplies. It was a supplement, a lifeline when rations grew thin. In years when the harvest had been poor, or the winter stretched longer than usual, the wild foods of Scotland's hills and woods became more than a supplement. They became the last defense against hunger. Still, one had to wonder, as families dug in frozen soil or cracked open the last hazelnuts, whether the land could always provide enough, or if one day the wild larder too might run empty before spring returned by midwinter. The landscape of Scotland offered little comfort to the eye or the stomach. Snow pressed heavily on the heather, and the wind carved across open moors with a force that made even the hardiest traveler turn their face away. Yet, for those who relied on foraging, the cold months were a time of careful strategy rather than resignation. The key was not only knowing what was edible, but also when to take it, and when to leave it for later in the season. Roots, though dependable, were best gathered sparingly. Families knew that if they harvested too many in early winter, the wild patches might be depleted before spring. Certain roots, such as those of wild parsnip and burdock, grew deep enough to resist frost for longer, and digging them up later in the season could provide fresh, if meager, meals. The act of digging in frozen earth required tools, wooden-handled spades, sometimes shod with iron for breaking hard ground. These spades were cherished and repaired often, for without them, the soil might as well have been stone. Hazelnuts, if well stored, became a precious commodity by January. A handful could be roasted on a flat stone near the fire, releasing a rich, warming aroma that seemed to bring the memory of autumn back into the home. Sometimes, children were sent out with sacks to check the ground beneath old hazel trees, in case a few nuts had been missed in the earlier gathering. More than one tale was told of a lucky find, a forgotten cluster hidden in the leaves, discovered when the pantry stores were growing dangerously low. Rose hips and other berries continued to be gathered, though by this point they were often shriveled and less sweet. Still, They held medicinal value, and in a time when illness could quickly turn deadly, such remedies were not ignored. Families might brew them into teas, not only for their tastes, but in the hope of warding off the fevers and coughs that were common in winter's damp chill. The foraging trips of this season were short and deliberate. The body could lose warmth quickly, and frostbite was a real danger. Foragers often worked in pairs, both for safety and to share the burden of carrying what they found. Paths to known foraging spots were well remembered, even when covered in snow, but a sudden storm could erase tracks and leave travelers disoriented. Some carried small bundles of straw or heather to mark their way back, a simple trick to avoid wandering off course. Trade between neighbors became more calculated as supplies dwindled. A jar of dried elderberries might be exchanged for a small sack of oats, or a bundle of burdock roots for a skein of wool to patch winter clothing. Such exchanges were quiet acknowledgments of mutual need, an understanding that survival in the Scottish winter was rarely an individual effort. By the end of February, when the land was at its leanest, foraging was no longer a way to supplement the diet but a desperate measure to fill empty bowls. Each trip carried the question of whether enough could be found to keep hunger at bay until the first green shoots of spring returned, and yet, as the days inched longer, the thought lingered. Would this winter's skill and caution be enough to see the family through to the thaw? By late winter, the effort of foraging in the Scottish Highlands became more than a matter of skill. It was a contest between human endurance and the unyielding cold. The landscape, once dotted with traces of life, had been stripped bare by months of searching hands and gnawing winds. Frozen soil clung stubbornly to what few roots remained, and even the hardiest plants seemed to retreat into the earth, leaving only pale, brittle stems above ground in these weeks. Every outing carried the weight of necessity. The hazelnuts carefully collected in autumn were now little more than a handful in a sack, cracked open sparingly as if each one might be the last. What berries still clung to the thorny hedges were dry, wrinkled, and barely sweet, yet they were gathered all the same. Families boiled them into thin stews, hoping their sharp taste might mask the monotony of boiled oats or root broth. Foraging in February was often less about discovery and more about revisiting old gathering places. With renewed hope, a thicket once stripped bare might, by chance, still hold a few overlooked treasures. A half-frozen bog might yield cattail roots, their starchy core a small but welcome addition to the pot. Even the bitter greens that pushed through patches of melting snow were seized upon, for their arrival signaled the spring was near, even if only a whisper of it. But the danger in these final weeks was greatest. The body, weakened by months of limited food, found it harder to withstand the freezing winds. Frostbite and exhaustion were common risks. Trips grew shorter, and often entire days were spent indoors, simply conserving warmth and strength. The fire became the heart of the home, and any food brought in was shared in silence, each person measuring their portion without complaint. For children, the hunger of late winter was a formative lesson. They learned the names of plants that could be eaten when nothing else remained. They memorized which tree hollows sometimes held a forgotten store of nuts, or where the ground thawed earliest. These small fragments of knowledge were not romanticized. They were survival tools, passed down with quiet seriousness from one generation to the next. And then, almost suddenly, the world began to change. By early March, the days lengthened, and the snow began to retreat in earnest. The first fresh greens emerged, nettles, sorrel, and chickweed, and though they were humble, they were a triumph. To taste something new after months of dried and stored. Food was a reminder that the cycle was turning. Yet the relief was never complete. Winter had taken its toll, and the memory of its leanest days remained close. Each spring, the same vow was made in countless cottages across the highlands. Next year, the stores would be fuller, the gathering more thorough, the rations more careful. It was a promise born not of hope alone, but of the deep understanding that the hunger months would come again, and they would demand the same patience, skill, and quiet determination. In the Scottish Highlands of centuries past, winter was more than just a season. It was a slow, unrelenting test of the human frame. By the middle of the hunger months, the body began to reveal what the long, cold, and meager meals had taken from it, even for those who entered winter strong. The gradual reduction in food wore away flesh and energy, leaving limbs thinner and movements slower. A Highland diet in winter was often little more than oats boiled into a thin porridge, occasionally thickened with turnip or kale, and perhaps a scrap of salted meat when luck allowed. Over time, this monotony meant that essential nutrients ran short. Weakness crept into the muscles first, making heavy tasks, hauling water, chopping wood, even walking through deep snow, exhausting. The cold worsened the feeling. With little fuel to burn, the body struggled to keep warm. Hands and feet suffered most. Poor circulation, combined with damp conditions inside stone cottages, left extremities numb for hours each day. For some, frostbite claimed toes or fingers before the thaw came. Others endured chilblains, painful, swollen skin caused by the cycle of cold and damp. A common ailment in homes where peat smoke filled the air, but warmth never truly reached. Every corner, illness found fertile ground in such conditions. A cough that might have been nothing in summer could linger for months in the winter air, sapping strength and appetite. Children were particularly vulnerable. Their smaller bodies lost heat quickly, and without enough food to sustain growth, they became thin and pale. The elderly fared no better, often taking to bed as weakness deepened. Mental strain accompanied the physical decline. Hunger was not only a dull ache in the stomach, but a constant distraction, a slow erosion of concentration and cheer. In the close confines of a Highland home, tempers could fray. Small disagreements over food, how much was eaten, who had taken a little more than their share, could cause lasting tension in a household that had to endure the same four walls for months on end. Yet, despite these hardships, there was also a deep resilience. People learned to work slowly, conserving energy where possible. They rose later in the morning and went to bed earlier, letting the long nights swallow hours they might otherwise have spent awake and hungry. Children were taught games that required little movement but kept the mind engaged. Stories were told by the fire, and the rhythm of daily chores, no matter how light, gave shape to the passing days. But the slow weakening of the body was inescapable. By late February, many Highlanders could feel it in every step, every lift of the arm, every breath drawn in the cold air. The question pressing at the back of the mind was not simply when spring would come, but whether the body would hold out. Until it did, would the first green shoots of spring arrive in time, or would the hunger claim another before the thaw? As winter wore on in the Scottish Highlands, the effects of hunger deepened, becoming part of daily life in ways that were both visible and invisible. The slow loss of body mass made faces appear hollow, with sharp cheekbones and tired eyes becoming a common sight. The skin, deprived of oils and vitamins, often turned pale and dry, sometimes cracking at the lips or fingertips. This outward appearance was a mirror of the body's inward struggle, as it worked to ration energy and preserve life in the face of limited food. Many families began rationing more strictly by midwinter. Porridge portions became thinner, and pieces of bread or bannock were sliced smaller than before. Even those who had started the season with a decent store of grain found themselves counting every scoop, knowing that the real challenge was not the beginning of winter, but its lingering end. Salted meat, if any remained, was saved for the sick, the elderly, or children, those least able to endure prolonged weakness. The lack of fresh food had another consequence: scurvy. While not as severe here as in places where sea voyages cut off access to plants entirely, Highlanders still suffered from sore gums, tooth loss, and slow healing of wounds during the long months without greens. Kale, when it could be kept alive in sheltered gardens, was a precious source of relief. But not everyone had the means to grow it. Cold made every ailment worse. Thin bodies lost heat more quickly, forcing people to huddle near the hearth. But even then, warmth was limited. Peat fires could smolder for hours, yet they produced more smoke than heat. In some homes, smoke clung low in the air, making breathing uncomfortable and further weakening lungs. Already stressed by cold and malnutrition, mental endurance was as important as physical stamina. People learned to accept the constant dull ache of hunger, knowing there was no quick remedy. Children were warned not to complain, as words could not conjure food. Instead, they were encouraged to think ahead to spring, when fishing, planting, and foraging would begin again. It was a survival of the mind as much as of the body, yet, as bodies weakened, accidents became more common. A slip while carrying water, a fall on the ice, or a minor cut could lead to serious trouble when strength was low and healing was slow. A simple injury in January could still be painful in March. By late winter, the line between the strong and the weak became stark. Some still managed to work in the fields when the weather allowed. Others could barely leave their beds. The community watched closely, quietly aware of who might not see the return of the green hills. And so the pressing thought lingered, quietly shared but rarely spoken aloud. How many more days of hunger would the body endure before spring loosened its grip? On the land, by the final stretch of winter, hunger had stripped away any illusion of comfort. The Scottish Highlands in late February or March could be bleak beyond measure, not the crisp beauty of snow under the sun, but the endless damp, grey cold that seeped into bones. The body, worn down by months of short rations, moved with a sluggish heaviness. Even small tasks, like fetching water or chopping kindling, became laboured efforts. Muscles, once strong from summer's work, had grown thin and stiff. This was the period locals sometimes referred to as the cruel weeks, the time when food stores were at their lowest, but spring was still too far away to offer relief. The oat bin might hold only a few weeks' worth, and every scoop taken out was done with a silent calculation. Each decision, a little more for the children, a little less for the adults, could determine who remained standing by the time. Lambs were born and fields could be worked again. Illnesses flourished in these conditions. A minor cough could grow into a deep, racking sickness that lingered for weeks. Fevers burned through the week, and with no doctor within reach, families relied on herbs, warm broth, if they had it, and prayer. Neighbors might come to help, but they too were tired and underfed, with little to spare. Yet, human resilience found quiet expressions even here. People told stories by the fire to distract from the gnawing emptiness. Old songs were sung, not with the lively pace of summer gatherings, but in slow, measured tones that carried a strange comfort. In some households, a single treasured luxury, perhaps a small jar of honey or a hidden stash of dried berries, would be brought out near. The very end, shared as a rare moment of sweetness in an otherwise bitter season. By late March or early April, the signs of change began to appear. Snow retreated from the lower slopes, and the first shoots of wild greens could be gathered from sheltered spots. Weak bodies craved this freshness, not just for flavor, but for the strength it promised to restore. Fishing nets were mended, fields cleared, and the cycle of work began again, though it was slow at first, for winter's toll did not vanish overnight. The hunger months left their mark. Some did not survive. Those who did carried the memory in their bones and in their caution. Each summer's work would be done with winter in mind. Every storehouse filled with the hope that the coming cold might be just a little kinder. And so, as spring returned, the unspoken question always lingered in the air, not whether winter would come again, but whether, when it did, they would be ready enough to meet it. In the long, dark months of a highland winter, when the fields lay silent beneath frost and the wind hissed down the glens, there was little to do once the daily chores were finished. Work still existed, of course, tending to the animals, checking the stores, mending clothes, but these tasks filled only a small portion of the endless evenings. With little light beyond the flicker of the fire, the hearth became the center of family life. It was here that stories were told, passed from old to young like heirlooms more precious than gold. The telling of stories was not merely a pastime. In a land where books were rare and the ability to read was not common, oral tradition was the vessel that carried history, values, and shared memory. Around the peat fire, elders would speak of clan battles long past, of journeys made across the mountains, and of harsh winters that attested the endurance of the entire village. These tales were often slow and deliberate, matching the rhythm of the quiet season. They were not meant to stir excitement, but to pass the time, to remind listeners that they were part of a longer story than their own lives. The children, wrapped in rough wool blankets, would sit cross-legged near the hearth, eyes fixed on the speaker. They listened not just for the content, but for the cadence, the pauses, the repetition, the turns of phrase that made the stories easy to remember and retell. Many of these stories served as subtle lessons, warning against wastefulness, praising loyalty, or explaining why certain customs existed. A child might learn through a long-winded tale about an ancestor's misfortune, the importance of rationing oats or tending livestock with care. There was also a comfort in the predictability of these evenings. Outside, the cold could bite deep, and food might be scarce, but inside, the warmth of the hearth and the steady flow of words created a small pocket of security. The smoke from the peat hung in the air, scenting clothes and hair, and the fire's glow made the dark corners of the room seem even darker, as though the rest of the world had ceased to exist. These gatherings were not always solemn. On some nights humor found its way in, a trickster's misadventure, a ridiculous misunderstanding from years past, or a playful jab at a neighboring village's expense. Laughter, though not loud or raucous, would spread like heat from the fire, and for a brief time the harshness of winter seemed far away. Yet, for all their value, these nights carried an unspoken truth. They were born of necessity. Without long evenings and limited work, there might have been no time for such long, winding stories. Without winter's hold, perhaps the elders' voices would have been too busy with labor to pass along the words that bound generations together. And so the hearth became more than just a place to keep warm. It was the anchor that held the community steady through the lean months. But as the wind rattled the shutters and the snow piled high outside, one question remained in every mind. When the stores began to run low, would even these warm nights be enough to carry them through? By midwinter, the rhythm of life in a Highland cottage had slowed to its quietest pace. Outside, the land lay in deep sleep, its surface sealed by frost and snow. Inside, the same hearth that had warmed the first nights of winter now served as the daily gathering place, the one reliable comfort in an otherwise uncertain season. The stories told here were not random. They followed a kind of invisible pattern, as though each night's tale was part of a much larger cycle, one that had been turning for generations. Some nights were devoted to family history, where elders recited the names of ancestors going back centuries. This was not simply pride or vanity, it was survival of memory. In a time when written records were scarce, a family's lineage could vanish in a single generation if not carefully spoken aloud and passed on. You might hear of great-grandfathers who fought in clan disputes over grazing land, or of mothers who endured famine by finding wild greens beneath the snow. Each name, each story, acted as proof that those who came before had endured equal, if not greater, hardships. Other evenings were given over to local legends, accounts of mysterious lights over the moors, of encounters with wandering hermits, or of ghostly apparitions on lonely paths. These tales, while often told in a matter-of-fact tone, had a quiet purpose. They kept younger members wary of the landscape, reminding them that winter's dangers were not only hunger and cold, but also the risks of straying too far from home. In some cottages, songs and ballads broke up the storytelling. These were slow, steady melodies that could be sung without instruments, their verses as much a part of the oral tradition as the spoken tales. Some songs told of distant lands visited by traders. Others described the seasonal tasks of farming in great detail, as if to keep the rhythm of work alive in memory even when the fields lay dormant. The act of storytelling itself became a skill honed over decades. An elder knew when to pause, when to repeat a line for emphasis, when to let the fire's crackle fill the silence. The pacing was never rushed. There was no need, for there was nowhere else to go, nothing else pressing to be done. Time stretched easily around the hearth, and if a story took 3 nights to tell, so be it. The youngest listeners might drift to sleep before the ending, their dreams shaped by the words they had half heard. The older ones would file away each detail, repeating them later among friends or during moments of work in warmer months. In this way, the hearth became both classroom and archive, preserving knowledge that would otherwise fade. Yet, beneath the quiet routine of these gatherings, a subtle awareness lingered, the same awareness that existed in every household through the winter, no matter how rich the stories or warm the fire. The true measure of survival would be found in the stores of food and the strength of the people when spring was still weeks away. How long could the comfort of words hold against the creeping reality of scarcity? As winter dragged into its final, most testing weeks, the role of the hearth as the center of life became even more pronounced. The fuel pile had grown smaller, and fires were kept lower to conserve peat and wood. But the tradition of gathering close each night remained unbroken. The air inside the cottage often felt heavy with the smell of smoke, wool, and the faint saltiness of stored food. Yet, to those within, This dim, flickering space was a sanctuary. By this time of year, the stories had a different tone. The playful tales of spirits or trickster animals gave way to more serious accounts. Memories of past winters, when the snow stayed on the ground until April, or when sickness had spread from one croft to the next. These were not meant to frighten, but to remind everyone that they were part of a longer chain of survival, that hardship had been faced before and endured. Sometimes, a pause in the storytelling would occur when an elder fell silent, staring into the fire as if weighing the worth of sharing certain memories. The younger ones knew better than to press. Some stories were too heavy to tell until the right moment came. Still, there were lighter moments, too. In the lulls between serious talk, someone might mimic a neighbor's habit of speaking or recall a humorous mishap during last summer's peat cutting. Laughter was as vital as warmth, a release of tension that kept the long months from pressing too hard on the mind. Even in the depths of scarcity, a well-timed joke could make the whole room feel lighter. It was also during these evenings that knowledge was passed in subtle ways: how to judge the thickness of ice on a lock, how to spot the signs of a coming thaw in the shape of clouds, or how to choose which seeds to plant first when spring finally arrived. None of this was delivered as a formal lesson. Instead, it slipped naturally into conversation, carried along in the flow of stories until it became part of the listener's own knowledge without them realizing it. As the weeks wore on and the daylight slowly began to lengthen, the mood around the hearth shifted. The tales began to end with mention of the first shoots of green, or of the birds returning to the moors. There was no clear point when winter ended and spring began, but the stories marked the gradual turning of the year as surely as any calendar. And so, when the day finally came that the door could be left open without a rush of icy wind flooding in, it felt almost strange to break the nightly tradition. The hearth, once the heart of survival, became once again simply the place to cook and warm. But the stories told in those long, lean months would remain, not just as entertainment, but as threads binding the past to the present. For, in the Highlands, survival was never only about the body. It was about carrying forward the memory of those who had survived before you. In the Scottish Highlands of centuries past, the final weeks of winter often felt like a test of endurance, not just for the body, but for the mind. The hunger months, as they were quietly called, were those leanest days when food was scarce, the cold was unyielding, and hope was measured in small acts of survival. By the time late March approached, many families were counting the last handfuls of oats or scraping the bottom of the salted meat barrel. It was during this time, when despair seemed close at hand, that the first signs of spring became more than just a change in the weather. They were a promise that life would continue. The earliest hint might be as simple as a shift in the light. The days, which had for months been dim and short, began to stretch, allowing the sun to linger a little longer in the sky. Its pale warmth might not yet melt the frost, but it lifted the spirits. On particularly clear days, one could look to the south-facing slopes and see the snow receding in irregular patches, exposing the dark, damp earth beneath. These spots of bare ground seemed insignificant, yet to those who had endured the long winter, they were as precious as gold. Soon after, the sounds of the land began to change. The wind, though still cold, carried a different tone, no longer whistling so sharply through the frozen heather. Birds that had been silent for months began to call, their voices hesitant at first, as though testing the air. For many, the first cry of the curlew or the sight of returning geese was a sure sign that the turning of the year had truly begun. The rivers, too, gave their own announcement. Ice that had gripped the shallows began to crack and drift, sending cold water rushing freely once more. For fishermen in coastal areas, this meant the gradual return of certain fish that had been scarce through the worst months. In inland communities, it was a signal that soon the ground might be workable again, and preparations for planting could begin. Even in the poorest cottages, where food stores were nearly gone, the mood shifted when these signs appeared. The talk by the hearth turned from how to stretch the last meal to what would be planted first when the thaw came. Children, who had spent the winter indoors, began to wander outside again, their boots crunching over the softening ground. It was as if the whole community began to breathe more deeply, but relief was not immediate. The gap between the first signs of spring and the arrival of actual abundance could be weeks long, and for many, those weeks were still difficult. Yet the promise was there, visible in the changing land and felt in the air. It was enough to keep people moving forward, to remind them that the struggle of the hunger months was nearly over. Still, one could not help but wonder, after such a long season of scarcity, how would people rebuild their strength and stores for the year ahead? Would the spring bring enough to erase the hardships of winter, or would its gifts be slow to arrive? As April pushed its way into the highlands, the landscape began to change in ways that were both subtle and deeply meaningful to those who had endured the long winter. The snow, once an unbroken white shroud over the glens and hills, retreated further each day, uncovering the heather and coarse grasses that had lain hidden for months. For the crofters and their families, this was more than just a change in scenery. It meant grazing land was returning for the animals, and the need to feed them from dwindling hay stores was finally lessening. Small streams that had been frozen since December now gurgled with fresh melt water, their sound a quiet reminder that the natural world was beginning its cycle of renewal. With the thaw came the first flush of green, young shoots of grass and tiny leaves pushing through the damp soil. These early plants were often too tender for harvest, but they signaled that soon wild edibles would return to the land. For families who had spent months rationing grain and dried meat, even the thought of fresh greens was enough to stir a sense of anticipation. Livestock, too, sensed the change. Cattle were led out more often from their winter shelters, their hooves sinking into the softening ground. Sheep began to range more widely, nibbling on the first hints of growth. For the farmer, these moments meant that the worst of the feed shortage had passed, and the health of the herd might recover with the coming pastures. In a subsistence economy, this was critical. The condition of animals in spring often determined whether there would be enough milk, cheese, and wool for the rest of the year. Yet, despite these encouraging signs, life in early spring was far from easy. The human body, worn down from months of limited rations, did not recover instantly. Many felt a lingering weakness, a tiredness that could not be shaken until fresh food and warmer weather fully returned. The hunger months had left their mark. Children were often thinner, and adults moved with a slower pace. Work in the fields, though necessary, was still difficult in the chill winds of early spring. Communities, however, leaned on shared labor and tradition to make the transition. Neighbors might help one another repair fences or mend roofs damaged by winter storms. Tools that had been set aside were brought out again, sharpened and made ready for planting. The soil, once it dried enough, would be turned for oats, barley, and root vegetables, crops that had sustained the highlands for generations. In the evenings, talk by the hearth turned more hopeful. Plans were made, not just for planting, but for fishing trips, market days, and gatherings once the warmer months arrived. There was a collective sense of cautious optimism. The land was stirring, and with it, so too were the people. But one question remained in the minds of many. After months of survival on so little, would the approaching summer be bountiful enough to restore what was lost, or would another hard winter already be waiting just beyond the horizon? By May, the highlands were transformed. The harsh browns and greys of winter gave way to rolling hills brushed with green, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and wild flowers. Birds returned in numbers not seen since autumn, their calls cutting through the stillness that had defined the hunger months. For many, this was the first time in months they could work outside without the constant bite of the wind. Fresh food slowly began to appear. Nettles, sorrel, and young dandelion leaves were gathered from the edges of fields and paths, boiled into broths that brought both nourishment and a welcome change of taste. Streams, now swollen with snowmelt, offered trout and salmon, a fresh source of protein after so many months of relying on dried or salted stores. For the first time in half a year, the meals on the table were not just about survival, they could be enjoyed. The livestock, now grazing freely, began to fatten. Milk yields increased, giving families not just fresh milk, but butter and cheese for the first time in months. These products were not only food for the household, but could be traded in nearby villages for tools, cloth, or even luxuries like honey. The rhythm of life shifted from simply enduring to actively rebuilding. But the relief of spring carried with it the memory of the months just past. Winter had stripped away any illusion of abundance. It had reminded the Highlanders that their survival was bound to the unpredictable patterns of nature. Every household knew that the coming months had to be used wisely, fields planted on time, animals cared for, and stores rebuilt before the first frost returned. The green hills might seem endless now, but in the highlands, winter was always closer than it appeared. Children, freed from the confines of winter, played in the open fields while elders sat outside their cottages for the first time in months. Soaking in the sun, the mood in the villages lightened, though not without a lingering caution. The joy of spring was never entirely free of the shadow of the next winter, and so the people of the highlands moved forward, gathering strength from the land's renewal, but never forgetting that it was only borrowed time. The hunger months had passed, but their lessons of preparation, of patience, and of endurance would guide every task from now until the frost returned again. One could not help but wonder, in a land where every year brought the same struggle, was spring truly a season of rest, or merely the first step toward the next trial? And so, our quiet journey through why life was brutal in medieval Scotland draws to a close. We've wandered through the cold winds and snow-dusted hills, listening to the soft echo of footsteps in long-forgotten villages, and the quiet voices of those who traded, worked, and waited for the spring that always seemed so far away. As the night deepens, I want to thank you for being here, for letting this story settle gently around you like a warm blanket. Wherever you are now, may your night be just as still as theirs once was. If you found peace in these moments, you're welcome to stay with me for the next journey. Perhaps by subscribing, only if it feels right for you. There's no hurry, no need. The stories will be here, waiting. Outside, the air grows quieter. The snow falls in slower, softer flakes. A candle burns lower in the window, its light warm but fading. And as the last ember glows in the hearth, we close our eyes to the hush of the old world and drift gently into sleep.